아세안 언론인 라운드테이블 아세안 속 한국의 길을 찾다 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 원활한 행사 진행을 위해서 휴대전화는 매너모드로 전환해 주시길 바랍니다. 본 행사는 한국어, 영어로 동시 진행됩니다. 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여진 통역기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어는 4번, 영어는 5번입니다.
Please make sure your cell phone is either off or on silent mode. Korean and English simultaneous interpretation is provided in this session. If you would like interpretation, please use the receiver provided at your seat. Korean is channel 4. English is channel 5.
Okay, first of all, I want to welcome all of you here. For those of you who aren't from Jeju, welcome to beautiful Jeju, as you've heard over and over. Our topic today is finding a pathway for South Korea in ASEAN. But the reality, of course, is the pathway has already been forged. The relationship between South Korea and ASEAN goes back decades, both for businesses and political figures. The relationship between these two sides goes, it dates, as the introduction to the panel indicates, from 1989, but has only strengthened year by year. Today we've got a distinguished panel of journalists here. I was adding up the number of years of experience of our journalists, and it adds up to 175 years of journalism sitting in front of you here, most of that in Asia. But in order to deal with a topic as broad as this, I'd like to focus on 3 areas. One has to do with how U.S.-China rivalry is affecting the relationship between ASEAN and South Korea. What risks does it pose? What opportunities does it pose? And that's the first topic. The second is more specific, the economic and political ties between ASEAN and South Korea. How they might be strengthened, what are the opportunities. And the third topic is people-to-people relations, the cultural communication between South Korea and ASEAN. Now, let me begin by introducing our 3 panelists and our discussant. Park Min-hee is a distinguished, well-known journalist here in South Korea for Hankore. Did I mispronounce that, Min-hee? She got her degree in history from Seoul National University, went on to study a master's program in Chinese studies, and started at Hankore in the Beijing Bureau in 2009, as also moved to the international desk to work as an editorial writer. I look forward to hearing, I know you've got plenty of thoughts on that first topic of ours, so we're looking forward to that. Our second panelist is Emmanuel Quezon III. Now, bear in mind that third, because I'll explain that in a moment. Manuel's nickname, by the way, and I'll refer to him that way, I know he doesn't mind, is Manolo. The Philippines has these charming nicknames for people. Manolo is what I would call he's a great journalist, but I would call a public intellectual. He's been a columnist for a number of years for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He's also very active in broadcasting on television and radio. He also is, I think he's the founder and certainly director of a museum in Manila. Prior to this panel, I didn't personally know Min-hee or Manolo, but with Leslie, we go back years. Leslie started his career at Reuters in covering Malaysia Brunei, Indonesia, and then moved to the Straits Times, and later where our paths crossed was when he joined in 1996 the Asian Wall Street Journal. Some of the best coverage of the Asian financial crisis was written by Leslie Lopez, and he moved on from there back to the Straits Times, and then the Edge in Malaysia, where he edited the Edge Review, and we worked together again during that time. And Leslie is known, in my mind, most as an investigative reporter. Nobody has covered, for example, the scandal of 1MDB with greater clarity and integrity than Leslie. And he's got a new book out on that, by the way, called The Siege Within by Penguin Random House. The discussant for today's session is Lynn Newman. We've known each other for years. Lynn started his career as a freelance writer in Southeast Asia, but quickly got a name for himself as a journalist around the region. He was the executive editor of the Hong Kong Standard, which at that time was a relatively small paper, and he turned it into a major competitor in that market against the South China Morning Post. Later spent a couple of years here in Korea as the editor of the Jungwon Daily, the English edition here. Subsequently became editor of the Jakarta Globe, a publication he and I worked together on. And most recently, from 2014 to 2025, you were working as the managing director of the American Chamber of Commerce. We also go back many years working together with Global Asia. So that's the panel that we've got. And Minhee, you want to take a stab at that first topic? U.S.-China relations and their impact on relations between ASEAN and South Korea.
안녕하세요, 정점입니다. 이런 좋은 자리에 초청받아서 너무 감사합니다. 특히 저도 개인적으로 이제 외교 안보, 중국 이런 이슈를 취재하고 있지만 그 아세안이나 저희랑 거의 가진 고민이 굉장히 비슷한데도 불구하고 아세안의 목소리가 어떤 것인지 굉장히 좀 진솔하게 듣고 싶다 이런 생각을 많이 했거든요. 예를 들어서 최근에 이제 싱가포르 로렌스 웡 총리가 이제 외교안보 포럼에서 지금 이제 이 시대가 완전히 전환기에 와 있고 이제 우리가 이제 알고 있던 오랜 그런 익숙했던 질서가 끝나고 이제 새로운 질서로 들어간다 이런 연설을 한 거 같은 게 이제 한국에서도 좀 주목을 받았지만 과연 이런 어려운 상황에서 아세안에 계신 분들은 어떤 생각을 하고 있나, 우리와 어떤 접점을 찾을 수 있나 굉장히 궁금했는데 그런 생각을 던져주셔서 너무 감사합니다. 일단 지금 첫 번째 퀘스천, it's a question about what is the influence of the U.S.-China rivalry on Korea or
Thank you, Duncan. How the rivalry between the U.S. and China, how does that affect the relationship between South Korea and ASEAN? Are they pursuing that relationship in a different way to build on that relationship in order to escape the flight of shrimp caught between whales, as the expression goes?
네. 일단 이제 저희가 보기에는 최근에 트럼프 그 관세 발표를 보면은 한국도 25%, 아세안 국가들도 10%인 국가부터 45%, 48%인 국가들까지 있는 거 보면 비슷한 고민을 하고 있겠구나 이런 생각을 많이 합니다. 뭐 지금 제일 고민되는 것은 미국과 지금 중국의 이런 라이벌리가 그 경쟁 관계가 심해지고 긴장이 높아지면서 거의 모든 나라에게 어느 쪽에 줄을 서라 선택을 하라라는 걸 다 요구하고 있다는 점에서는 한국 아세안이 다 비슷한 상황이라고 생각이 됩니다. 그래서 일단은 우선 이제 지금 한국이 처한 상황이랄까 이것을 조금 말씀드리고 싶은데요. 저희 동료들에게 많은 분들 아시겠지만 어떻게 생각하면은 한국은 이제 1990년대부터 2010년까지는 지금의 국제 질서에서 굉장히 좀 많은 수혜를 본 나라였던 것 같습니다. 그런데 이제 2010년 무렵부터 미국과 중국의 이제 그 선택 압박이랄까 긴장이 높아지고 미국이 피보트 아시아 정책을 하고 그 이후로는 이제 한국이나 뭐 아세안 국가들 모두 선택의 이제 압박에 직면을 했는데 이제 그 무렵에 2010년, 2012년 무렵에 남중국해에서 이제 중국이 핵심 이익이라고 주장하고 인공섬을 만들고 할 때 한국도 이제 그 사드 그 고고도 미사일 방어 체제를 배치하는 문제를 가지고 중국과 여러 갈등이 있었던 거를 다 알고 계실 겁니다. 그런데 한국도 이제 그때 약간의 이제 안보적인 면에서는 어떤 선택을 하려고 계속한 것 같아요. 그래서 박근혜 당시 대통령이 2015년에 뭐 시진핑 주석과 같이 천안함에 올라갔다거나 좀 중국과 가까이 함으로써 북핵 문제나 이런 거를 좀 풀려고 하시던 시절이 있었는데 그 뒤에 사드 갈등으로 한국은 더 안보적으로 이제 뭐 조금 더 어려운 상황에 지금 처해 있다고 할 수 있고 지금 또 문제는 이제 이런 미중 경쟁국에서 북핵 문제를 풀기가 점점 어려워지고 2019년에 이제 베트남 하노이에서 논의를 한 다음에 이제 북한의 핵 문제는 더 강화되고 북한, 중국, 러시아가 연대하는 구도 같은 게 생겼다는 이런 어려움이 있습니다. 그리고 지금 한국에게 제일 어려운 문제는 이제 새 정부가 들어오겠지만 트럼프 2기에 이제 아까 관세 전쟁 이거 말고도 제일 어려운 문제는 역시 이제 트럼프 2기에서 중국에 대한 안보적인 경제를 강화하는 문제가 될 것 같아요. 이제 최근에 이제 트럼프 2기 정부에서 얘기하고 있는 거는 한반도에서 주한미군은 앞으로 중국을 견제하는 성격으로 바꾸고 북한의 압력은 한국이 알아서 해결하라 이런 식으로 지금 요구를 하고 있는데 이제 새 정부가 들어와서 만약에 주한미군이 중국을 견제하는 군대가 된다면 중국은 거기에 더 반발하게 되고 하는 이런 안보적 선택을 해야 되는 게 지금 한국으로서 가장 어려운 부분입니다. 그리고 경제적으로는 뭐 사실 이 부분에 대해서 특히 동남아 국가들하고 비슷한 처지 고민을 많이 하고 있을 것 같은데 일단 트럼프의 관세 문제를 대응하는 거, 그 풀어가는 과정에서 미국과 어떤 주고받기를 해야 되나 하는 거가 굉장히 어려울 뿐만 아니라 또 하나의 문제는 이제 중국의 첨단 기술력의 발전, 그다음에 거기서 오는 과잉 생산의 문제, 중국의 굉장히 질 좋은 제품이 굉장히 저가격으로 쏟아져 오는 문제가 있는데 여기서 아마 한국과 아세안은 같은 고민을 좀 할 수도 있겠지만은 또 어떻게 생각하면은 각각이 다 그 문제에 버겁게 돼서 한국과 아세안 또는 뭐 많은 분들이 한국, 아세안, 뭐 일본, 유럽이 이 문제에 같이 대처해야 된다 이런 제안도 하지만 과연 그거에 대해서 우리가 가능할 수 있을지 서로 어떤 협력할 지점을 찾을 수 있을지 하는 거가 굉장히 중요한 토픽이 될 것 같습니다. 그리고 세 번째로는 그 이제 뭐 남중국해 문제도 있지만 지금 한국에서 이제 중국과 서해상에서 그런 그 해상 경계 문제 이런 문제도 앞으로 좀 커질 텐데 그 문제에 대해서 조금은 다른 점도 있고 비슷한 점도 있지만 최근에는 이제 많은 분들이 그 같이 남중국해 문제와 한국의 서해 문제를 같이 보기도 하는데 이 문제에 대해서 서로 어떤 참고점을 찾을 수 있을지 중국이 이렇게 경제적뿐만 아니라 그 해상 영향력이 커지는 거에 대해서 어떻게 좀 같은 고민을 나누고 어떤 참고점을 찾을 수 있을지 이런 것도 같이 아마 생각해 볼 점이라고 생각합니다.
Let me weigh in now from an ASEAN point of view. Leslie and I are going to give you two sort of different perspectives because I'll be speaking from the perspective of a country that has had a very antagonistic relationship with China. And without preempting Leslie, I think Malaysia is the opposite story. The fundamental difference here is that the Chinese approach is to settle any questions bilaterally, country to country, which of course is asymmetric. The Philippine position and that of the United States and other countries would be a multilateral approach. The fact that the ASEAN Code of Conduct on the South China Sea has not prospered or gotten anywhere near resolution in close to 20 years is, I think, a testament to the effectivity of the Chinese approach to block any sort of consensus. For the part of the Philippines, it was traditionally that we were, in a sense, at a draw because Cambodia was traditionally viewed as the spokesperson for the Chinese point of view. The introduction of Malaysia, I think, has sort of tilted the. So I don't know if you can consider it a draw anymore. Where then does South Korea enter this picture? In the past, the question that faced countries like the Philippines and ASEAN as a whole was how reliable, how constant can American policy be considered? That at the end of the day, and if you remember, there's this Australian defense writer, Hugh White, who pointed out that every time they gained out, let's say, Taiwan and that sort of thing, American public opinion would not allow full-on American involvement in the case of outbreak of war. So how constant would American policy or commitment to a multilateral approach, including defense, be vis-a-vis the Chinese who are steady and absolutely committed to their both foreign diplomacy? Here, the risk was magnified because for a few years from towards the end of Biden, you could see that there was an emerging decision or approach that was bringing in South Korea and Japan and India and Australia as sort of the guarantors of stability and this multilateral approach in our part of the world. One by one, the commitment of these countries for generally domestic political considerations has wavered somewhat. We, for example, in the Philippines are watching to see what the outcome of your presidential elections will be. It was also the case that the instability in terms of the ruling party in Japan led to questions about how the resolve of Japan. Now, I would point out that what South Korea brings to the table with all this doubt is your industrial capacity. In the case of the Philippines, for example, it is the very strong ties between your defense industry and our government. We are creating basically a navy from scratch because of Korean shipbuilding capacity. We didn't really have an air force to speak of for a decade until Korea had started selling us jets that we could afford and that were good value for money. This has allowed us to, for the first time actually in our history, go from a hand-me-down approach to our defense to one where we can say we are paying our own way and building a credible minimal defense. This in turn has given us a standing before our number one partner, the United States, in that we don't always have our hand out to them, which changes the dynamic somewhat just in the nick of time for the Trump administration. But again, whether the larger ability of South Korea to manage its relationship with Japan, which will be necessary because both countries are required to sort of, in a sense, support us in coming up with an ASEAN point of view, that remains unknown and to be seen.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up where Lolo left off, actually. The relationship, what's happening with ASEAN today is very interesting. I think how quickly the region, the association, which despite all its shortcomings, remains a very, very organized player today. I think what's happening today is that the embrace and how China is beginning to embrace that, how ASEAN, which is currently led by Prime Minister Anwar, and Malaysia, which is occupying its championship, is pushing ahead with such intensity that in many ways it's unprecedented actually. You know, the way China has warmed up, and I don't think China has warmed up to any kind of grouping the way it's done with ASEAN in recent times. And that alone I think presents a number of challenges. And for starters, there are a lot of benefits for countries in ASEAN who see China as a kind of a counterbalance, not just in terms of diplomacy, but also from an economic standpoint, huge market and everything else. And the other thing is that how countries in the region are taking some pretty high risk in embracing China. One good example, I think, is the rollout of the 5G network in Malaysia. I mean, the government put in something like $4 billion for the first operator. That was going to be the only operator. But shortly after the Anwar government came in November 2022, they surprisingly decided, even at the risk of huge overcapacity, to have a second operator in 5G. And it was announced recently that Huawei and ZTE will become partners who will handle this rollout. I mean, it's a very serious thing given the US threats. But here is something China wants to do. They need a country that will adopt their 5G network. And Malaysia is willing to risk that at a huge. So all of this, there are challenges and benefits. But I think all of this presents is other problems for other countries. Like South Korea has long had a relationship, not just with Malaysia, but other countries in the region. But it was always as the production hub, manufacturing center, cost competitive one, but that I think that model has already reached its shelf life. What South Korea needs to do, and I think only will happen after the elections, is how you recalibrate this relationship with ASEAN that's already there, but at the same time with the view that how do you compete and try and have a position that will come close to where China is today in terms of its relationship with the ASEAN grouping. And with that, I'd like to.
Glenn, would you like to pick up from here? Oh, sorry, Ann. Yeah, thanks very much. A very interesting opening remarks from everybody. The common thread that I'm hearing here is that we have a changing world. The U.S.-China rivalry is reshaping things, and then added to that, and all three of you have touched to some extent on security issues, less than not directly, but certainly the Huawei decision is a security matter for the United States. The Philippines is caught in the unenviable position of having China operating in its territory, having international law on its side, and having nobody being able to do anything about it, And these constant images that we see of those poor guys stuck out on Scarborough Shoal trying to get some corned beef and skyflakes in is a sobering reminder of what the Philippines is facing. And for Min Hee, she also talks about security and the times that countries have been forced tried to be forced by the United States and others to choose sides. And so, which is something that nobody really wants to do. And of course, you echo back to the THAAD controversy, which just drove Beijing crazy. And it's striking to me that in the era of Trump, in which the dominant, there's a couple of themes there that are emerging, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists if you might want to discuss this. One is Trump prefers bilateral discussions, like China, right? It's interesting that the ASEAN summit is ongoing at the moment in Malaysia, and Anwar sent a letter supposedly to Xi Jinping and said, hey, let's all get together for a meeting. ASEAN wants to talk to you. And it was reported that in Nikkei Asia that the tentative date is October. ASEAN said as soon as possible. The Trump administration said, let's try October. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about the seriousness with which the Trump administration anyway is taking ASEAN. And it's kind of a tragedy in the way we're talking about ASEAN, and I kind of throw this comment in that ASEAN has been a very, very effective vehicle for getting other countries to talk to each other through the plus mechanism, through the +3, etc. It's been the best place in the world for countries like China and the United States and India and others to find a place to talk to each other. But ASEAN itself, in my view anyway, perhaps this is unfair, but ASEAN itself has been unable to handle its own business. I mean, look at Myanmar, no solution. The new chair comes in, whoever it happens to be, and says, oh, I'll fix this. And this has been going on for years, and it doesn't get fixed. So ASEAN itself has to look at its effectiveness. It hasn't been able to help the Philippines with the problem with China. China just ignores it. So what Leslie mentions is quite interesting. Now you have China engaging more. Right before the summit opened, the Chinese foreign minister met with all the leaders of ASEAN in KL, and that's the first time that has happened, to my knowledge, and that was quite striking. So with Trump kind of distancing himself from international engagement seemingly, and seeing things on this kind of purely transactional basis, the question then becomes, well, is and this is what I'd like you to reflect on, is the field really open for China to just go in and do what it wants? What's the counterbalance? We have a piece running in Global Asia Forum online at the moment that suggests that this will force Japan and South Korea into a closer alliance to try to take up some of the slack. I don't know if that'll work, but I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts on what's the logical conclusion of where this goes, given the very different stance of the United States and given China's embrace of ASEAN, aided and abetted by Anwar Ibrahim, and what are the not just security but economic repercussions of this? How does this play out in each of your respective areas? And we can start with whomever wants to start.
Well, let me break up because all politics is domestic. So the number one factor, I think, is probing the domestic standing of China culturally and economically in each of the ASEAN countries. I would say as a sort of broad generalization that you would have a greater sort of bias against China culturally on the part of, let's say, Filipinos to a certain extent, Indonesians or even Malaysians, and that their societies are sort of finely balanced, and any sort of undue advantage to the Chinese diaspora in those countries has political repercussions, including the acceptability of warming relations with Beijing. That's the first. The second, of course, is the impact on the domestic economy. So, for example, in the current era, it's a question of dumping. That could mobilize, for example, even domestic business to express some caution. The third is that these are both sort of imperial powers, and the thing is that what China is trying to promote is that they're the adults in the room, especially in view of the sort of mercurial behavior of Trump. The problem is, at least from my biased Filipino perspective, is that China is not particularly adept yet on the sort of the pleasant side of diplomacy. So it can come across as a bit didactic and heavy-handed, which is counterproductive to the Chinese approach. So in our case, I think you will find that this is something that periodically stymies China, even though the atmosphere is very conducive to they're stepping into the vacuum that, in a sense, the Americans have created. The final point I wanted to raise was in the Philippines and in other countries, Cambodia and others, it's the existence of a different diaspora. It's the ones who are engaged in online gaming and gambling, we call them POGOs, which is a priority of Beijing to stamp out because it is drawing away capital from China. It's the Chinese themselves are creating problems as an economic drain. And here, some countries will be more cooperative with China. Malaysia, I think, is a very good example, and others not at all. The Philippines, we may be changing from administration to administration in our welcoming China, but we are consistent in putting domestic profit from these illegal or unsanctioned activities ahead of formal relations with Beijing. And that is another complication.
I'd like to take up again where Manuel's mentioned about how you balance this relationship. While Malaysia clearly is is showing its very, very deep embrace of China, the feelings are not mutual among other members of ASEAN, who are kind of wary because they want to strike a balance with the US, and because of their long relationships with the US, economic and also diplomatic. Singapore is a good example. And I think what is happening now is that I would like to just highlight why the Malaysian position is, and it's also complicated by domestic politics. It's international agenda. As you know, Malaysia's Malaysia has been very, very outspoken pro the Palestinian issue, very pro-Palestine. And this recently, after Trump came to power, became an issue because the US had actually met with Anwar and raised this issue about being anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, because of Malaysia's recognition of Hamas has become an issue with Washington. So you can understand now why, because Malaysia doesn't want to dilute its position on what's happening in Gaza. You can see now that we go towards China. But it is not a sentiment that is widely shared by the rest of the people, rest of the countries in ASEAN. So I think that is something that needs to be understood and always in the back of our minds when talking about this.
네, 지금 그런 균형이라고 할까? 그럴 때 지금의 이거에 대한 균형을 잡는 데 대한 어떤 쉽고 단순한 답은 나올 수가 없는 것 같고요. 한국에서도 마찬가지일 것 같습니다. 지금 얘기해 주신 것처럼 어떻게 보면 여론이나 한국은 이 두 분이 말씀하신 케이스 어떤 중간에 있는 닮은 점이 말레이시아 닮은 점도 있고 필리핀이랑 닮은 점도 있는 것 같은데요. 예를 들어서 한국에는 지금 여론에서 보면 굉장히 중국에 대해서 우려하고 걱정하고 어떻게 말하면 혐오하는 그런 그게 굉장히 문제가 되고 있습니다. 어떤 사람 그러니까 중국에 대해서 정당한 비판을 하는 것도 있지만 중국에 대해서 모든 것을 불안해하고 두려워하고 중국이 한국의 선거를 다 개입한다. 지금 이번에 이제 저희 한국 윤석열 전 대통령이 경험을 할 때도 중국의 간첩들이나 중국의 선거 조작 때문에 경험을 했다 이런 식으로 할 정도로 했고 또 많은 사람들이 그런 우려를 합니다. 그런 것도 있는데 그렇지만 또 한편에서는 중국과 경제적으로나 이런 관계, 그다음에 북핵 문제에서 중국의 협력 이런 것이 없으면 안 된다는 이런 것도 있어서 두 개 굉장히 중국과의 협력과 중국에 대한 우려 두 가지가 다 엄청나게 혼재돼 있어서 쉬운 그런 결론이 없습니다. 한국이 새 정부가 온다고 해도 안보적인 면에서는 좀 더 미국과 협력을 더 하겠다 이런 식으로 하는 지금 모든 후보들이 그렇게 할 수밖에 없고 특히 북핵 문제나 러시아, 북한의 군사적 협력이나 이런 한국의 안보적인 상황이 굉장히 어렵고 특히 리인이 말씀해 주신 것처럼 지금 미국이 후퇴한다. 그래서 국제 질서가 완전히 우리가 지금 알던 질서와는 달라지고 있다. 앞으로 어디 갈지 모른다라는 우려가 너무 크기 때문에 이런 불안한 상황에서 일단 안보에 대한 어떤 닷을 내린다고 할까요? 그래서 한미 동맹 강화돼야 된다. 한미일 안보 협력을 더 할 수밖에 없다. 이런 얘기는 다들 합니다. 그렇지만 한쪽으로는 다 의구심이 있는 거죠. 미국이 이렇게 달라지고 이제 믿을 수가 없게 되고 여기서 후퇴하고 아니면 이제 제국주의 시기라고 할까요? 이제 동맹들이 더 가격을 내고 대가를 내고 동맹들이 더 미국에 내놔야 된다. 이런 걸 할 때 어디까지 우리가 할 수 있을까? 그런 다 고민에 처해 있다고 봅니다. 그리고 또 지금 이제 아세안 사이에서 중국에 대해서나 미국에 대한 입장에 분열이 있다고 하셨는데 한국 사회 자체에서 그 분열이 심하거든요. 아마 많은 나라들이 마찬가지지만 조금 더 미국하고 더 가야 된다, 중국하고 가야 된다. 이런 것이 그 나라들 사이에서 그러니까 한국 사회에서 굉장히 심해지고 있어서 그 자체가 앞으로 굉장히 큰 문제가 되고 있고 이 문제를 어떻게 봉합할 것인가가 사실 한국에는 굉장히 중요한 과제가 될 수 있고 이 문제가 잘 봉합되어야 아세안과의 협력도 사실은 좀 더 안정적으로 갈 수 있다고 생각합니다. 네.
Then, maybe you want to add that? It's a complicated world we live in. This is all of these strands of conversation have gone on for a long time. But it seems to me unique, the current moment is unique in terms of how South Korea is going to deal with the United States and whether South Korea can trust the United States. And the fact that there's even a discussion about that is quite staggering. That's quite an interesting and disturbing development, which is somewhat new. I mean, no one, the two countries in Asia that would have been the U.S.'s most trusted allies would be, of course, Japan and South Korea. The Philippines also is an ally, but it's a different dynamic. But that strikes me as one thing, and I was very struck by what he said that unless you can fix the polarization in Korean society, which we witnessed since the crazy declaration of martial law. I hope I don't offend anybody by saying crazy, but all my Korean friends agree. But since that declaration of martial law, which really exposed a lot the divisions again, kind of what we saw when Park Geun-hye was booted out, that to me is a very striking comment that the divisions have to be settled. And also it's striking to me. Again, we're talking about Korea's relationship to ASEAN, which has always been quite good, but we're really talking about China and the United States for the most part, and the internal dynamics in each of these countries are quite striking. My most recent experience living in Asia was in Indonesia and part of the time in Singapore, and there's no love lost in the Indonesian public for China. And as there isn't in the Philippines because of what's happened, and probably not also among a lot of Malaysians. And so the comment that I think it was Leslie who said, or someone said that the comment that, and this continues, that China has been unable to be appealing. It's like it's the toughest kid on the block, but nobody likes him. Everybody does business with him because they don't want to get beat up. So if the one thing that I would add to this is that the United States has found itself in a position of everybody being kind of pissed off and uneasy about our president. The question is, can Xi Jinping find a way to be more appealing? And should China figure out a way to sell a softer side of China, if that's even possible? I think there's a clear path ahead for China. I have my doubts over whether that's possible given the Chinese system, but that to me is also a subtext here, is that, you know, China's the perception of China in each of these countries is quite interesting. And the history, of course, I mean, the Korean history most especially, but everybody's history with China is quite mixed and difficult. So that's one thing. The one thing I would add from the Indonesian kind of observer of Indonesian side is that Indonesia is, as you may know, Indonesia's foreign policy is always this business of, you know, 1,000 friends and no enemies. And the incursions of China into the Riau, you know, the 9-dash line goes all the way into Indonesia. And the foreign ministry in Indonesia never wants to talk about it. Never wanted to talk about it. And it's always struck me several years ago that the first mention that I read of China's incursion with the 9-dash line into Riau was written by General Muldoko, who at the time was the chief of the armed forces, went on to become the chief of staff of President Joko Widodo. But he was the first one, when he was chief of staff of the armed forces, to write about the China incursion into Riau, or the China extension into Riau. And that adds an interesting dimension to the discussion. I mean, Prabowo was very aggressive about going after Chinese business and being open to China. And they had this extraordinary agreement just on Sunday that the trade between the two countries would be settled in rupiah and yuan, and that's a groundbreaking decision on the part of the two countries and a real challenge to the dollar. But what I'm concerned about, or what I would like to think about, I don't know the answer, is what's the security dimension for Indonesia? Because they're constantly having Chinese Coast Guard ships and Chinese fishing ships and all this stuff coming into Indonesian waters. But the Indonesians are very careful to say nothing about it. Meanwhile, they get support and assistance from U.S. intel, U.S. Coast Guard technology, etc., to monitor what's going on, and they're constantly afraid that somebody's going to say something about it. But it is an issue. And Indonesia has too much at stake economically, I guess, with China to want to say anything about it. So that's just a couple of comments on the same kind of security and relations with China thread.
Before we move on to the next topic, I just wanted to pause and ask if there are any questions about this issue, U.S.-China rivalry and its impact on South Korea and ASEAN, and potentially the relationship between those two sides. Any questions? Just raise your hand.
Can South Korea promote its ties with ASEAN countries? You know, just ignoring the influence of China and the United States. And what kinds of strategies ASEAN countries have? If South Korea is really sandwich, and ASEAN countries sandwich, then we should pursue strategies to promote mutual interest between ASEAN and South Korea, regardless of influence or pressures coming from Washington and Beijing. Is it possible to promote that kind of bilateral ties? If so, what kinds of strategies can we pursue?
Professor Moon, if I could, I would say that keep doing what you're doing. We were, the five of us were chatting before this session and sharing anecdotes about South Koreans in the Philippines, South Koreans in Indonesia, South Koreans in various other countries. And one of the things that always struck me about the South Korean community, the Korean community in Indonesia, was how incredibly well integrated they have become, to the extent that you could hardly find a country that has, other than the United States, a country that has greater soft power attraction in Indonesia than South Korea. Everybody wants to be BTS. They have whole factories to create the next Indonesian, what is this pink group? I can't even. Blackpink, forgive me. I just show my age and ignorance. But there's a great, the thing that South Korea has done so effectively, as we all know, starting with the Korean wave, is to integrate itself and its citizens very well into the life of the countries where it operates, much better than Americans do, certainly better than the Chinese, who are isolated. But to me, that's something to build on. Now, how that gets bigger and how it takes shape as a middle power and affects the geopolitical security is unclear, but I do think that South Korea has an instinctive and intuitive way of integrating itself into the societies where it operates. Chiefly among that, as you go to work for, South Koreans go to work for Korean companies in Indonesia, right away they learn to speak Indonesian, and within a few years they become citizens. They become Indonesians. They're still culturally Koreans, but they become Indonesians, and as a result, the government of Indonesia, for the most part, looks very kindly on the Korean presence. You just don't hear any complaints about it. I don't know what the experience is of others.
Yeah, if we could get them, because we were discussing this before this afternoon. Both of you were discussing these close ties. So why don't you pick up on what Lynn said and expand on it?
I actually outlined something in the paper here about the dilemma of Korea, as you were asking, is it has vulnerabilities, but it's looking for the leverage. Lynn was talking about, everyone agrees the soft power is tremendous. In the past 30 years, you made a shift from the identity of Korea and ASEAN was that it was a member of the small club of newly restored democracies 30 years ago. Today it is the leader culturally for the world. But it does not give Korea leverage, I think for a reason that I only understood during the protests against the president that was impeached, which was that it was considered a very big thing if any artist even sent sandwiches to the rally. So there is no connection between that soft power and any sort of mobilizing for a larger, let's say, cause for our part of the world. So what leverage then does South Korea have? I think it instead it has vulnerabilities precisely because of the Korean diaspora, where, for example, in the Philippines, I served one president, but both his successors, President Aquino's successors, all three presidents faced the same problem when dealing bilaterally with South Korea, which was the first thing on the table placed by any South Korean president is, what is happening to my countrymen who are kidnapped or threatened or extorted from? And that dominates all conversations. I'm sure we're not alone. Maybe we're the most extreme in that problem for South Korea, but that is a problem wherever there is a diaspora. And what is the leverage of Korea in response to that? In the Philippines, there was no leverage because there was no wide economic investments until the defense industry became so vital to our future. Now there is real leverage because whether they'll give us preferential rates or even the number of jets or frigates that you will build can be tied to the ability of the Philippine government to deliver on those things. What is the equivalent of this in Malaysia or Indonesia or elsewhere? it prevents, to my mind, a cohesive approach on the part of South Korea for ASEAN. And at the end of the day, it will always go back to security because of tied together with Japan and vis-a-vis China. So you can't escape it in that sense.
Unlike the Philippines, I can say that the level of integration before the Chinese arrived, there was mainly Japanese investors and South Korean investors. Under the premiership of Mahathir that began in 1981, and this drive to attract investment from them with huge, very sweet incentives actually was very successful. And one thing about the Korean community, which like Lynn said, in Malaysia they are extremely integrated. While the Japanese can be a little aloof, very much to themselves, the Korean community has actually really integrated very well. And I think that's a real advantage actually for Malaysia. There's no angst or anything like that with Koreans, and they really mix very freely with this. You can't say that about the Chinese. The relationship Malaysia has today with China is at the top level. I've been trying to get into stories about China. No one in the embassy will talk to you. The diplomats don't talk to you. They keep to themselves. I've had problems trying even to locate any Chinese reporter in Kuala Lumpur. I've been trying for the last 6 months. No one wants to talk to you. No one wants to talk to you. It is completely different with the Korean diplomatic mission there. They are so helpful. They want to play golf with you. They want to have drinks with you. They talk openly. Want to know about what's happening. Want you to introduce them to more locals. So that I think is a very stark difference. And they actually, each time reporters come to Malaysia, they'll say, look, can you help up these guys with contacts? So you get a very different kind of approach. And I think that is something to leverage, take advantage of, and because you already have it and others don't.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
한국인으로서 살짝 놀랐습니다. 왜냐면 저희가 하고 있는 게 너무 부족한 점이 많다고 계속 생각해 왔거든요. 예를 들어서 이제 정부 차원에서 보면은 그 문재인 정부 때 신남방 정책이라고 해서 아세안과 협력도를 높이려고 여러 정책을 했는데 이제 그때 아마 people prosperity 하여튼 이런 거를 같이 하자 이런 걸 했었는데 이제 또 정부가 바뀌니까 이제 미국 인도 태평양 정책이 너무 흡수돼가지고 이 신남방 정책이 일관성 있게 되지 못했다라는 저희끼리 반성이 있었어요. 아까 이제 일관성 얘기했는데 일관성이 좀 많이 부족했다. 그리고 또 저희끼리 하는 얘기는 한국 사람들이 이제 동남아 가서 동남아에서 이제 한국의 K-팝이나 이런 데 대한 관심을 보여주는 거에 비해서 한국 사람들이 현지 역사나 문화에 대한 이해도가 좀 낮고 부족한 게 아닌가. 그래서 최근에 이제 중국의 영향력에 비해서 너무 이제 우리가 부족한 게 아닌가 이런 생각을 했는데 또 이전보다 나아진 점도 있다고 하니까 상당히 우리가 좀 나아진 점들을 더 해야 될 것 같고 저 개인적으로는 좀 한국이 더 아세안 국가들이 현지 눈높이를 맞추고 그러니까 그쪽에서 우리에게 관심을 가져주는 것 못지않게 우리도 그쪽에 더 관심을 가져야 된다. 현지를 더 이해해야 된다. 저희는 그렇게 또 생각하고 있습니다. 그런데 그래서 좀 이제 좀 잘하고 있는 점은 좀 더 소프트 파워랄까 이런 게 조금이라도 있다면 좀 더 해야 될 것 같고 또 이제 지금 이제 얘기를 듣다 보니까 우리가 아세안의 각각의 나라의 고민이 다른 것 같아요. 예를 들어 말레이시아나 인도네시아는 중국에 대해서 훨씬 더 이제 이해도가 높고 접점이 많은 것 같고 필리핀은 더 우려가 크고 이제 한국과 안보 협력 같은 걸 하고 싶다. 그래서 아마 한국이 이런 점들에 대해서 각각의 고민에 대해서 더 공감하고 거기서 이제 좀 서로의 접점을 찾아야 되는 게 아닌가 저는 이제 그런 생각을 하면서 들었습니다. 그리고 저 이제 개인적으로 하나만 질문해도 될까요? 최근에 이제 관세 전쟁을 했는데 트럼프가 관세 고율 관세를 발표한 뒤에 굉장히 중국이 잘하고 있다고 생각한 게 뭐 이제 최근에 말레이시아에서 왕이 외교부장이 가서 다 같이 회의를 했지만 이제 바로 그 트럼프 관세 발표된 지 뭐 일주일 정도 만에 시진핑 주석이 직접 가가지고 캄보디아, 베트남, 그 세 나라, 말레이시아인가요? 세 나라를 직접 찾아가서 이렇게 직접 정상 외교를 하고 해서 이런 미국이 아세안에서 뭔가 이렇게 괴롭히는 역할을 할 때 중국은 이제 같이 한다 이런 제스처를 보여준다든지 굉장한 외교를 하고 있다고 생각합니다. 사실 뭐 이거는 뭐 이런 가치 판단을 뭐 좋다 나쁘다를 떠나서 중국이 좋다 나쁘다를 떠나서 굉장히 잘하고 있는 점이라고 생각하거든요. 근데 또 약간 흥미로웠던 건 굉장히 베트남도 말레이시아도 캄보디아도 환대를 하고 난 다음에 시진핑 주석이 떠나자마자 일본 배가 들어오게 한다든지 또 뭐 중국산 수출품 그 생산지 증명을 다시 조사한다든지 이렇게 약간 미국을 향한 제스처를 많이 보였다는 거죠. 그래서 그런 제스처에 나오는 것은 어떤 지금 아세안 국가들 심지어 말레이시아처럼 중국에 대해서 굉장히 우호적인 국가들도 중국 영향력이 너무 강해지는 것에 대해서는 큰 우려를 하고 있는 점이 있다고 봐야 될까요? 그런 점도 좀 얘기해 주시면 좋겠어요.
Very true. I mean, it's a delicate dance for the Malaysian government. About that episode that I mentioned earlier about the ambassador meeting with Anwar, this very secret meeting, there were a number of issues that were raised. One was the sale of Iranian oil that takes place to this transshipment and in the Straits of Malacca from vessels from Iran onto China ships and then taken out. And this is really a ridiculous problem because Malaysia's production is about 450,000 barrels a day, but its exports are about 1.2 million barrels per day. So where is this extra coming from, right? So from what I understand, the U.S. showed satellite images and everything else of this taking place. So that's one issue. The other issue was Malaysia being used as kind of a conduit to get chips that were exported from the US to Singapore, then kind of repackaged and then sold to China. So all of these issues were raised together with the issue of Hamas and Israel. So Malaysia is in a very, very dangerous position. So it's like I said, it's a delicate balance, and it is. And I think Anwar Ibrahim's approach is not without risk. It's actually very, very high risk. So these are. I mean, I agree with you. These are issues, and this is how countries now are trying to navigate this very, very difficult situation between two powers.
Now, if we could just move to the business relationship, extensive business relations with South Korea and ASEAN. What are your thoughts on what does South Korea do well in the investment area, foreign direct investment in the countries of ASEAN, and how could it improve? If we could just go ahead and do it.
Actually, I think South Korea is doing well. Its engineering companies, construction companies have strong presence in Malaysia, and they are highly regarded, and I would say even they are probably preferred to compare to Chinese contractors. What China does well is that it comes with the financing, which is a big attraction. But as far as capabilities, technology transfer, I think the Koreans have done a lot more for Malaysia than Japan or China. China is coming out now to sell actually. So how South Korea leverages on that, I'm unsure. But clearly it is in a good position and well accepted. The thing about Korean businesses, especially in the engineering and construction sectors, they get very little media play, but they are actually very, very much present in the economy and present in very effective ways and considered reliable partners actually.
I pick up from what Leslie said because the Philippine experience with Chinese investments, especially state-driven investments, was that sooner or later it would lead into some sort of political crisis, and it would then lead to problems with the bilateral relationship. The Philippines, for example, does not have much to offer South Korea in terms of factories or attracting manufacturing, but it is proven to be fruitful in terms of, for example, Manila Airport, which is, I'm not being unpatriotic by saying this, is one of the worst in the world, is now being managed by Incheon Airport, and as someone who travels regularly, I can tell you that in the few short months as this has happened, I can see the difference in terms of our light rail and other engineering cooperation. Shipbuilding, we are now rising as a shipbuilding nation because of our South Korean investment. So, and all without controversy. Even Japanese investments, such as in building our airport, became a congressional investigation. There's not been this there's not been a kind of political minefield, which is great for business, for government, and for people-to-people relations.
저희 이제 1대1로 제가 알기로는 이제 중국의 1대1로 정책이 또 아세안 국가마다 다르게 받아들여지고 있는 것 같아요. 어떤 국가에서는 약간 정책 문제가 되기도 하고 어떤 국가에서는 그럼에도 불구하고 더 많이 받아들이려고 하는 그런 게 있는 것 같은데 한국은 그 점에 그러니까 뭐 산업화 그러니까 한국이 그 FDI 아세안에 대한 그런 그 투자를 보면은 일본에 비해서는 확실히 이제 후발주자죠. 일본 70년대 80년대부터 많이 했는데 한국은 그보다 훨씬 늦게 이제 동남아시아로 많이 이제 투자도 하고 하긴 했지만 아직은 조금 일본에 비해서는 후발주자다 그렇게 생각하고 있고 그것 때문에 조금 일본의 영향력이 조금 덜 강한 뭐 베트남이나 이런 국가에 더 많이 투자를 한 걸로 알고 있습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 이제 한국 기업들의 고민은 베트남이 이런 데서 굉장히 많이 투자를 했는데 중국 기업들이 들어와서 너무 강한 최근에 중국 제조업이 이쪽으로 많이 이전하면서 한국 기업들이 상당히 그 경쟁력에서 많이 밀리고 있다. 특히 중국 국내에서 최근에 첨단 제조업 역량이 너무 강해지고 있기 때문에 그런 고민을 한국 기업들이 많이 하고 있습니다. 그리고 이제 1대1로에 대해서 논쟁은 있지만 워낙 중국 정부의 이런 정책 차원이 큰데 한국은 그런 부분이 부족하다 보니까 만약에 그 앞으로 이제 새 정부가 들어와서 다시 이제 아세안 정책을 좀 더 강화한다면 그런 부분에 대해서 아세안 국가들이 요구하는 어떤 그런 걸 조금 더 잘 정교하게 해야 되지 않을까. 왜냐하면 이제 사실은 이전 몇 년 동안 최근에 한국이 ODA 같은 거랄지 이제 그런 아세안이나 다른 국가들에 대해서 조금 투자를 할까 ODA를 더 많이 해야 된다 이런 거는 많이 했고 실제 예산도 많이 늘렸거든요. 근데 그거를 가지고 조금 더 정교하게 정책을 해야 되는 것에 대한 부족함을 느끼고 있었는데 아마 최근에 한국도 이 트럼프 정부가 굉장히 이제 언스테이블해지면서 아세안이나 다른 국가에서 더 열심히 해야 된다 이런 인식은 한국인들도 많이 하고 있기 때문에 그런 정부로서는 정책적인 ODA나 이런 걸 어떻게 정책적으로 잘할지 그다음에 한국 기업들의 고민은 이제 중국 들이 엄청난 첨단 제조업 역량에서 어떻게 할지 이런 고민을 하고 있는데 최근에 이제 아까 다른 동료들 말씀해 주셨겠지만 중국산 제품이 너무 강력하게 덤핑 가격이라고 하고 중국은 우리 경쟁력이 강해진 거라고 하는데 그렇게 될 때 뭐 한국뿐만 아니라 각국에서 약간 최근에 중국 정부의 눈치를 조금 보면서도 중국산 제품을 조금 막기 위해서 관세를 부과한다든가 이런 점이 있는데 이런 부분에 있어서는 조금 한국과 아세안이 같이 고민을 얘기하고 같이 좀 정책 구조를 맞출 수 있는 부분이 없는지 그런 점도 같이 한번 생각해 봤으면 좋겠습니다.
Glenn, do you have anything to add?
Well, looking at this from the Indonesian perspective, the Korean companies have played a pretty aggressive and very positive role in the government's eyes on the EV side. Now, most of the EV investment in Indonesia has been Chinese, but a lot of that is downstream or rather upstream and pretty dirty processing of nickel. It's actually an environmental disaster of unknown proportions. Indonesia's big move into nickel. But Korean companies like Hyundai and LG and others have been very aggressively moved into the EV space. Hyundai, I believe, was the first company that announced that it would build electric vehicles in Indonesia, and they build the electric Ioniq in Indonesia, and that's been a great thing for the Indonesian government. They can point to that and say, well, here's this wonderful international company, and they're part of our big push into electric vehicles. The other side of this, however, is that sometimes it can come back and bite you, because LG Energy, I think it is, had signed up for a total of about $10 billion of investment into a big EV battery plant in Indonesia, which they've recently withdrawn from. And the press reports on the withdrawal cited the company believing that the market for EVs is changing. The nickel, as we know, may no longer be or will no longer be as important in EVs as it has been. Indonesia has staked its future on nickel, which is filthy to produce, and they may have put their money in the wrong basket. It was interesting to me that LG made that decision. The Indonesian government, however, then quickly announced, no, we kicked LG out. We told them to leave. They're too slow. So the Indonesians, in that case, were their own worst enemy. And whereas they should have been paying attention to what LG was saying and sat down and have a conversation with them. I'm struck by what Manolo said about the fact that a lot of the Koreans who were living in ASEAN, in the Philippines earlier, were lower income and smaller businesses, smaller jobs, etc. But that the profile is rising now that the Korean heavy industry is coming in the form of the defense industry and shipbuilding, etc. I think that's been the pattern in Indonesia as well. Once companies like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and others started making big investments in Indonesia, their profile, at least in the eyes of the government until this kerfuffle with LG, but their profile was higher. And again, I think the Indonesian government, for the most part, feels very comfortable dealing with Korean businesses. They have a good reputation, good corporate citizens. They manage themselves well. The competition with China with regard to FDI is China has the capital and the financing, but they also just sign a deal with China for several $billion, and you wake up and discover that the entire project is being staffed by Chinese down to the cooks for the camps and stuff. So you don't get as much local employment. They've kept it quiet, but there have been riots at some of the Chinese facilities especially in the nickel area. Because of disillusionment with the Chinese companies, and so they're very unpopular in the local areas where they operate, and it really upsets the Indonesians to see, especially this business of why do the Chinese need to have their own cooks? That really just drives everybody crazy. Can't the Filipinos or Indonesians or anybody else can make a plate of fried rice. You don't need that. And this is the same thing that's hurt China in Africa as well. The other thing that struck me from the conversation is mention of the Belt and Road. The Indonesians, I think to their credit, they signed one Belt and Road deal, the Jakarta-Bandung Railway, which is losing money, which bankrupted at least one or two of the big Indonesian construction companies. and that was a Belt and Road initiative. That's the last one. And they announced that they're not going to take any more because they've seen the experience of Sri Lanka and Pakistan and others where the debt burden becomes severe. And so they're quite allergic to Belt and Road projects. They're quite happy to get Chinese financing for other kinds of projects, but so far they haven't wanted Belt and Road. Keep your eye on an announcement that was made yesterday that they're going to extend this Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway all the way to Surabaya, which, if you know the geography of Java, that's a real railroad. That's a real trip. That's a 15-hour train right now. They're going to cut it to 3.5, and they're doing the preliminary studies now, and they announced it yesterday to do that with China. Of course, the announcement was made by Luhut Panjaitan, and sometimes his announcements get a little ephemeral later, but it remains to be seen if it's true. But keep an eye on that and see if that becomes a Belt and Road thing or how that goes, because that's a major undertaking. And when it comes to competing, of course, yes, the Chinese show up with tame bankers ready to sign deals, and the companies themselves, and they all do what they're told, and big deals always come out of these gatherings in the countries. South Korea doesn't operate that way. I don't think South Korea shows up with Hanwha Bank and says, okay, give these guys a loan. So that kind of financing is difficult to compete with. Plus, the sheer size of China is impossible to compete with. But my vantage point, and I used to be quite close to the Korean Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia, my vantage point is that South Korea generally does it right on the investment side, and that it's well regarded.
Could I ask the two of you to speak a little about this? There's one common thread here is the perceptions of South Korea among people in ASEAN. Is that an area where South Korea outcompetes China? I'm hearing a lot of hostility, about China or Chinese practices in terms of economic investments. And how does that feed into more broadly the perception Southeast Asians have of South Korea? And that includes the Korean wave and South Korea's soft power.
It's interesting. Something just struck me. There's a lot of attention about this soft approach of Korea comes with a culture, the boy bands and all that kind of stuff. Well, what I think is needed, and one is that while that gets all the attention, very little of what happens on the economic and the business side gets reported. A lot of things are taken over by the Belt and Road. Everyone knows the kind of Belt and Road now. But few people want to talk. And this one struck me because before coming here, I was reading quite a bit about what's happening in South Korea and all that kind of stuff. There's one thing that struck me was the Arctic group that one of your presidential candidates is talking about. And that's actually, I think, quite a novel idea, worth exploring. And given shipping routes are always an issue, it is something which is, if it's going to be shorter, and with the thinning of ice sheets in the Arctic, this could be really a viable plan. It could be a viable plan, and could be a viable plan as early as 2030, actually. So I think capturing the public imagination, even the media people, of this kind of potential initiatives would help kind of raise the profile of South Korea, that it's not just playing second or third fiddle to Japan and China, but really a country that has got long-term vision about what should happen.
I'll speak very frankly because there are three levels here. I would say that there is the level of the business and managerial and political class, where South Korea, to use an old-fashioned term, is an honorable partner. It is one that does not extort. It is one that deals properly and in a dignified way with partners. There is a cultural relationship, but I think we have to make a distinction that the Korean wave and the dominance of Korea's soft power is particularly strong, I would argue, with the middle class of ASEAN. Not the masses, but the middle class, and speaks to them. But there is the third class, the poorer laboring classes, are human exports. I mean, for the Philippines, for Indonesia and other countries, as well as those Koreans who are part of your diaspora. So, very bluntly speaking, for what will color the first sort of view of South Korea is not what your government is doing or your businesses are doing. It's the South Koreans who come, let's say, to the Philippines to be able to afford a more comfortable life in terms of having household help and drivers and a house instead of an apartment, and teach their children English and get away from military service. There's that, and inevitably, the reputation of a country is dictated by the most extreme of its citizens. So there will be cases, for example, where don't rent your home to a South Korean because they're aggressive. It's probably one or two families, but it's colored the whole relationship. I'm sure there are equally negative things said about Filipinos who come here to work, and that sort of thing. So these levels are happening simultaneously, and it is the intimate domestic level that will color all the other two, in ways that the policymakers and the investors and businessmen cannot control. In the Philippines, I think on the whole, as I mentioned, it has been colored by questions of personal security, which overshadows that we forget that the South Korean community in the Philippines is now in its second generation. There's my wife was teaching in university, and her students a couple of years ago were college students, South Korean, but born and raised in the Philippines and going to Philippine universities. And it will not be far off before these South Koreans are learning Korean as a second language. You know, and here, I'm sure you have had more and more interactions with Filipinos who are coming here, often not as professionals, but as laborers. But that will change over time, precisely because of the soft power, with more and more middle-class Filipinos and therefore professional Filipinos having essentially been formed in the Korean language, and therefore having an inroad to coming here as nurses and others.
Any comments on that?
여기 지금 동남아에서 한국의 이미지에 대해서 하고 있어서 제가 정확하게는 잘 모르고 저는 지금 여기 듣는 입장이었는데요. 그래도 일단 먼저 린 얘기 먼저 듣고 나서.
South Korea's image, I think, well, by and large, I've lived in virtually all these countries except, I haven't lived in Malaysia, but I think the South Korea's image is by and large good. You just don't hear people complaining about South Koreans. They know how to carry themselves in a way in that society, in Indonesia anyway, that is well respected. And I think that's to the benefit of South Korea. However, South Korea is a small country compared to Japan, China, and the United States, and so there's a certain amount. If South Korea were what would it be like if South Korea were 5 times bigger, and the impact and the behavior was the same? South Korea would be a bigger player, for sure. I think South Korea, as we say in the United States, plays above its weight. It gets a lot out of very little, which is one of the remarkable things about Korea. And I think that is also noted in its relations in ASEAN. And I am, just as a side note about the way ASEAN people maybe perceive one another in some countries, and this is related to the Philippines. Just an anecdote, but it's one that I've always appreciated. Because there's such an export of Philippine labor, Filipinos get really tired of being thought of as maids and domestic helpers and prostitutes and God knows what, construction workers in places like Hong Kong or Singapore and elsewhere. In Indonesia, Filipinos love being in Indonesia because the instant thought is, oh, these are middle managers. These are technical people. These are accountants and people who operate in companies. So that from country to country, people have different perceptions of each other. It would be great if you could find a time when ASEAN would rise together and some of these disparities would go away. But that's an aside about ASEAN. It's just something I think about from time to time. But as far as South Korea, I think the future is bright for South Korea, assuming that it can navigate this very difficult security dilemma that it faces, and that there's hope. I really do hope in that regard that the historical grievances that exist between South Korea and Japan can finally be resolved and put away on a shelf someplace, so that South Korea and Japan can work together as a very effective middle power or large middle power force in the region, should China continue to be aggressive, which I'm sure it will be, and should the United States fall away in its commitments. I think that's something that's very important.
저도 간단히 말씀드리면 이제 저는 한국의 입장에서 보면 이제 아까 데이비드 질문이 한국이 그 아시아에서 우리가 중국의 대항마가 될 수 있냐 이런 질문이었는데 그건 불가능하다고 이미 다 말씀해 주셨고요. 이 사이즈, 한국의 사이즈와 한국의 영향에 맞게 할 수밖에 없는데 뭔가 긍정적으로 지금까지 만약 효과가 있다면은 그런 거를 좀 가지고 우리는 아세안에서 뭐 중국의 대항마가 아니라 그냥 아세안과 같이 갈 수 있는 어떤 오히려 약간 동료 같은 그런 역할을 하는 게 더 맞다고 생각합니다. 한국의 입장에서 약간 거꾸로 한국에 와서 이제 많은 동남아 출신 노동자들이 계시고 여기 결혼 이민자로 온 분들이 많은데 사실 한국이 초기에 한 15년 전에 굉장히 잘못한 게 많고 해서 한국 사회에서 시민사회에서도 이제 한국이 결혼 이민자나 노동자들에 대해서 잘못한 처우를 하고 있는 거에 대한 많은 비판이 있었고 지금도 여전히 문제가 많지만 좀 그런 거에 대해서 이전보다 융합적이고 덜 차별하고 여러 가지 하려고 좀 노력을 하고 있는데 그런 면에서 더 노력을 많이 하면서 좀 한국은 아세안의 거의 같은 비슷한 위치의 동반자다 이런 거를 계속 노력해 나가야 된다고 생각합니다.
Thank you very much. We're short on time now, just a few minutes. Any last question from the floor? No? Lynn, do you want to, any concluding remarks? Oh, I didn't see. Okay.
Hello. Hi. I'm also a journalist as well with a company called See Today. It's based in Indonesia, Southeast Asia today. And I was wondering, as journalists yourselves, you must have experienced a lot of different depth of information wherever you've been stationed at. I think I know one of your colleagues as well, Leslie at CNA as well. It does seem like journalists are everywhere, but it's difficult to get the sort of the knowledge that you have all together in a forum like this. I've heard great things from Lynn about the actual culture, the actual sort of the human life of different countries and why there's a division. sort of divide between the more advanced countries like Korea and advancing countries in Southeast Asia. I was wondering if there could be any sort of a way to bring all those knowledge together, some method to actually have a forum like this where actual sort of substantial action can be taken based on not just professionals in certain sectors, engineers or whatever, but some things that you mentioned in this forum as well. What could be a way to actually coexist and actually make things better, all these human differences and cultures in the region?
I think we were actually talking about this earlier, that one of the problems that that's faced in Asia is the lack of a regional unifying media. That unfortunately the media tends to be very self-centered. CNA is an exception. What C Today is doing is an exception. There are exceptions, but I think one of the things that's needed is, I hope it's happening. Maybe it's happening in social media, but that there needs to be more communication across countries to help build this. And I don't know if it's not another conference, although I love going to conferences, but I think there needs to be greater harmony or greater interest put into media and communications across the region. I worked for several years trying to build independent media in Southeast Asia at an earlier phase in my career. And one of the sad things is that with the exception of a few outlets, most of the media in Indonesia now is controlled by tycoons. The independent media in the Philippines is dying, unfortunately. There's some glimmers, there have been some glimmers of hope that comes and goes in Malaysia. Hong Kong, of course, is now under the thumb of the Chinese, so you're not going to see anything come out of there. So actually the media landscape for this kind of dialogue is less fertile than it was 20 years ago. And that to me is a subject for a different panel at a different conference, but that your comments prompted that thought for me.
Look, I'd like to thank Minhee, Manolo, Leslie, and Lynn, and especially all of you for attending. Thank you very much.